They say a mother's love is unconditional, but nobody talks about what happens when that love becomes invisible, when the hands that once held your child close are suddenly seen as burdens to be hidden away. My name is Evelyn, and I'm 58 years old. For 37 years, I wore a simple gold wedding ring that told the story of a love that death couldn't destroy. Today, I sit in a place that smells of disinfectant and broken dreams, writing words I never thought I'd have to write. But let me start from the beginning, because every story of betrayal begins with trust. 3 months ago, I was recovering from surgery in what I thought was the safety of my son David's home. The guest room had become my temporary refuge after a hip replacement that left me vulnerable in ways I'd never experienced. At 58, I'd always been the caregiver, 30 years as a registered nurse, countless nights spent healing others, and then years dedicated to raising David alone after my husband Thomas passed when our boy was only 12. I raised David to be kind, to value family, to understand that love isn't measured by convenience but by presence during the storms. Or so I thought. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting by the window, watching the autumn leaves fall like golden tears, when I reached for my wedding ring to turn it. A habit I'd developed over decades of marriage. The simple gesture that brought me comfort, that reminded me Thomas was still with me in some way. My finger was bare. Panic shot through me like electricity. I searched the guest room frantically, my healing hip protesting every movement. Under the bed, in the bathroom, between the sheets, nothing. This wasn't just jewelry. This ring had been placed on my finger 40 years ago by a man who promised to love me through sickness and health, until death do us part. Even after death had claimed him 7 years ago, I'd kept wearing it because some promises transcend the grave. "David!" I called, my voice shaking. "David, I need help!" My son appeared in the doorway, but there was something in his expression. A flicker of guilt that a mother recognizes instinctively. Behind him stood Camila, his wife of 3 years, her arms crossed and her face wearing that particular smile that never reached her eyes. "What's wrong, Mom?" David asked, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. "My wedding ring," I whispered, holding up my naked hand. "It's gone. I can't find it anywhere." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. In that silence, I watched my son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for, the man I'd helped through college working double shifts at the hospital, the person I'd trusted with my life, exchange a look with his wife that told me everything I needed to know. "Maybe you put it somewhere safe," Camilla said, her voice honey-sweet and poison-sharp. "You know how forgetful older people can get after surgery." Older people. As if 58 made me ancient. As if the anesthesia had somehow stolen my mind along with my mobility. But I knew. Deep in my mother's heart, I knew. If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. That evening, as I lay in the guest room that suddenly felt more like a prison than a sanctuary, I heard them talking in the kitchen. Their voices carried through the thin walls of the house I'd helped them buy with my life insurance payout after Thomas died. "She's going to keep asking about it." David's voice, uncertain and guilty. "Let her ask," Camilla replied, ice in her tone. "What's she going to do? She can barely walk." Something inside me withered then, not broke. Broke implies something violent and quick. This was a slow decay, like watching a flower die petal by petal. My own son, the child I'd rocked through fevers and nightmares, the teenager I'd supported through heartbreaks and failures, was now discussing me like I was an inconvenience to be managed rather than the woman who'd given him life. I pressed my bare hand against my chest, where my heart was learning a new rhythm, the unsteady beat of betrayal. The ring finger felt cold and naked, exposed in a way that made my entire body feel vulnerable. For 40 years, that ring had been my anchor, my reminder that I had been loved completely by someone who chose me every single day, until God called him home. Now I was learning what it felt like to be chosen for abandonment. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by phantom sensations of the missing ring and the growing certainty that my carefully constructed world was about to collapse in ways I wasn't prepared for. Outside the window, the autumn wind rattled the glass like fingers drumming impatiently, And I wondered if this was how it felt to become invisible in your own life. Tomorrow would bring answers I wasn't ready to hear, but tonight, in the darkness of a guest room that smelled of other people's lives, I was still just a mother trying to understand how love could become such a one-way street. The woman who had spent her life healing others was about to discover that some wounds cut deeper than any scalpel, and that sometimes the people closest to your heart are the ones most capable of stopping it from beating. The truth came 3 days later, delivered with the casual cruelty that only family members seem capable of perfecting. I was sitting at their kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped David with homework 20 years ago, where I'd celebrated his graduation, where I'd welcomed Camilla into our family with open arms and genuine hope. Now it felt like a courtroom where I was both the accused and the evidence to be dismissed. Camilla walked in wearing a silk blouse that cost more than my monthly medication budget, her phone pressed to her ear as she discussed restaurant reservations with someone I didn't recognize. She moved around me as if I were furniture, present but irrelevant, taking up space that could be better utilized. The infinity pool was absolutely divine, she was saying, her voice animated in ways it never was when she spoke to me. And the spa treatments? Heavenly. We should definitely go back next year. My stomach dropped. Infinity pool. Spa treatments. These weren't local weekend getaway conversations. These were expensive vacation stories. The kind that required significant money. Money they claimed they didn't have when I'd offered to help with groceries last month. When she finally hung up, she noticed me sitting there, really noticed me, for the first time in days. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, my name falling from her lips like an afterthought. "Still worried about that little ring." Little ring. 40 years of marriage reduced to a dismissive phrase. 40 years of love, of promises kept through sickness and financial struggles, and the devastating grief of losing the man who'd been my anchor. Little ring. It wasn't little to me, I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. It was everything. Camilla sat down across from me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my blood run cold. Not guilt, not shame, satisfaction. The look of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Evelyn," she said, leaning back in her chair with practiced patience, "you need to understand something. David and I are building a life together. A real life. We have goals, dreams, plans that require investment. I don't understand what that has to do with we sold it." The words hit me like a physical blow. Simple, direct, devastating. We sold it. Not lost it, not misplaced it, not accidentally damaged it. Sold. Past tense. Done. Irreversible. What? The word came out as barely a breath. Your ring. We sold it. She examined her perfectly manicured nails as if discussing the weather. "David found it in your jewelry box when you were sleeping off the pain medication. We needed the money for our trip to the Maldives. It was just sitting there, not being used for anything important. Not being used for anything important. My wedding ring, the symbol of the greatest love I'd ever known, the tangible reminder that I had mattered completely to another human being, not important. You had no right," I whispered, my hands shaking so violently I had to clasp them together. "That ring. Thomas gave me that ring. Thomas is dead, Evelyn." Her voice was sharp now, impatient. "He's been dead for 7 years. Wearing his ring isn't going to bring him back, and honestly, it was just depressing to see you clinging to the past like that." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling like I was drowning in my own home. No, not my home. Their home. I was just a temporary guest who'd apparently overstayed her welcome. "Besides," Camilla continued, warming to her theme now, "you won't be needing jewelry where you're going." "Where I'm going." David chose that moment to walk into the kitchen, his face flushed and his eyes unable to meet mine. My son, who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken hearts, now stood in his own kitchen looking like he wanted to disappear rather than face his mother. "Mom?" he started, his voice strained. "We've been talking, and we think it would be better for everyone if you had more professional care." Professional care. The euphemism landed between us like a bomb with a delayed fuse. "You mean a nursing home," I said flatly. "A care facility," Camilla corrected, as if pretty words could disguise ugly intentions. "Somewhere with trained staff who can monitor your medications, help with your physical therapy, make sure you're getting proper nutrition. You'll be much happier there." Happier. Without my wedding ring. Without my son. Without any connection to the life I'd built over nearly 6 decades. Happier in a place where I'd be just another elderly woman whose family had decided she was too inconvenient to love anymore. "I'm recovering perfectly well here," I said, though even I could hear how weak my voice sounded. "The physical therapist said I'm ahead of schedule. I don't need—" "Mom, please," David interrupted, finally looking at me but with eyes full of something that looked like pity. "This is hard for all of us. Camilla works full-time now, and I travel for business. We can't give you the attention you deserve." Deserve. What I deserved was honesty. What I deserved was respect. What I deserved was the consideration you'd show a stranger, let alone the woman who'd raised you alone after your father died protecting this family with his life insurance policy that helped buy this very house. So you sold my ring to pay for a vacation, and now you want to put me away so you can enjoy the money without looking at the woman you stole from. The words came out calm, which surprised me. I'd expected to scream, to cry, to collapse. Instead, I felt something cold and clear settling into my chest. "That's not—" David started. "That's exactly what it is," I said, standing slowly, my healing hip protesting but my spine straight. "You sold the last piece of my marriage to fund your pleasure trip, and now you want me gone so you don't have to face what you've done." Camilla's mask slipped then, just for a moment, and I saw what had probably always been there: contempt. Pure, undiluted contempt for the woman who'd given her husband life, who'd sacrificed her own dreams to ensure he had every opportunity, who'd welcomed her into the family with genuine love. "Evelyn," she said, her voice now openly cold, "you're being dramatic. It was just a ring. You're not getting any younger, and frankly, clinging to symbols from the past isn't healthy. You need to face reality. You're not the center of David's world anymore. I am. We are building something together, and that requires making difficult decisions about excess baggage. Excess baggage. That's what I'd become to the son I'd carried in my body for 9 months, nursed through infancy, protected through childhood, supported through college, and loved unconditionally for 31 years. The silence that followed was deafening. David stood there, my beautiful boy who used to tell me I was his best friend, and said nothing. Nothing in my defense. Nothing to contradict his wife's assessment of his mother as excess baggage. Nothing to acknowledge that the woman standing before him had shaped every good thing about the man he'd become. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't just losing my ring or my temporary home. I was losing my son. The child I'd raised had become a stranger who could watch his wife destroy his mother and choose his silence over her dignity. The bonds that had sustained me through decades of single motherhood, that had given my life meaning and purpose, were breaking one cruel word at a time. And the most devastating part was that one of the people wielding the knife was the person I'd loved most in this world. Tomorrow, they would drive me to a place where I'd become just another forgotten woman whose family had decided loving her was too expensive, too inconvenient, too much trouble. But tonight, I would lie in their guest room and remember who I used to be before I became excess baggage in my own son's life. Sunset Manor wasn't the worst nursing home I'd ever seen, but it wasn't chosen for my comfort. It was chosen for their budget. The lobby smelled of industrial cleaning supplies, trying unsuccessfully to mask other odors I recognized from my nursing days. The furniture was functional rather than welcoming, and the staff moved with the efficient distance of people managing too many needs with too few resources. David carried my single suitcase, the same one I'd used for our family vacations when he was small, now containing everything they'd decided I was allowed to keep from my 58 years of life. Camilla walked beside him, checking her phone and making small talk with the intake coordinator about visiting hours and payment schedules. "She's very independent," Camilla was saying, as if I weren't standing right there. "Probably won't need much attention. She's used to taking care of herself." Independent. That was their story now. That this abandonment was actually a celebration of my self-sufficiency. Not that they'd stolen from me and discarded me, but that I was so wonderfully independent that I didn't need family anymore. The intake coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, reviewed my paperwork with practiced efficiency. "Insurance covers the basic room and meals," she explained to David. Any additional services, private physical therapy, upgraded meals, recreational activities, those would be extra charges. Just the basics will be fine, David said quickly, not looking at me. She doesn't need anything fancy. Doesn't need anything fancy? The woman who'd worked double shifts to pay for his saxophone lessons, who'd driven him to every soccer practice and school play, who'd gone without new clothes for 3 years to help with his college expenses. She doesn't need anything fancy now. My room was on the 3rd floor, shared with a woman named Rose, who spent most of her time staring out the window at a parking lot. The space was divided by a thin curtain that provided the illusion of privacy, while ensuring you heard every cough, every nightmare, every lonely sob from the other side. "This is nice, Mom," David said, his voice artificially bright as he set my suitcase on the narrow bed. "Look, you have a view of the garden." I looked. Through the small window, I could see a patch of brown grass and a few struggling bushes. In the distance, the parking lot where their BMW sat waiting to carry them back to their real life, the life that was apparently much better without me in it. "The dining room serves meals at set times," Mrs. Patterson was explaining. "Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 5. There are activities in the common room, bingo on Tuesdays, crafts on Thursdays. Church services on Sunday for those who want to attend. Activities designed to keep elderly minds occupied, to provide the illusion of purpose while marking time until death." I looked around the room and tried to imagine myself here in 6 months, in a year, in 5 years. Would I become like Rose, staring out windows at parking lots? Would I forget what it felt like to have a purpose beyond organized entertainment and scheduled meals? "We should let you get settled," Camilla said, already backing toward the door. "We'll visit soon." Soon. The word that meant never, delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. David hesitated at the door, and for a moment I hoped, that my son might resurface from wherever he'd hidden inside this stranger's body. That he might remember bedtime stories and birthday cakes, scraped knees I'd kissed better, and dreams I'd helped him chase. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly, and I heard the guilt in his voice. "Do you?" I asked, and the question hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had burned everything beautiful. He left without answering, and I was alone with Rose and the smell of industrial disinfectant and the sound of other people's lives continuing without me. That first week, I tried to be the Evelyn I'd always been, friendly, helpful, engaged. I introduced myself to other residents, offered to help women who struggled with buttons or medications. I attended the craft sessions and attempted to find joy in gluing felt flowers onto picture frames that no one would ever display. But slowly, I began to understand how invisibility works in places like this. The staff were kind but overworked, providing care with efficient compassion that couldn't extend to genuine connection. Fellow residents were lost in their own struggles, with memory, with pain, with the slow acknowledgement that their families had made the same calculations David and Camilla had made. During visiting hours, I watched other women receive flowers and grandchildren's drawings, listened to conversations about family dinners and holiday plans. I sat in the common area with a book, pretending to read while actually watching the door, hoping each time it opened that I might see my son's face. But David didn't come. 2 weeks passed before my phone rang. I almost didn't recognize his voice. It sounded different, lighter somehow, as if removing me from his life had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Hi, Mom. How are you settling in?" Settling in. As if this were a college dormitory rather than the place where his mother was slowly disappearing. "I'm fine," I lied. Because what was the truth? That I cried every night? That I'd started talking to Rose even though she never responded? That I'd begun to understand why some of the women here simply stopped eating and waited for death to provide the escape their families had denied them? "That's great. Listen, Camilla and I wanted to let you know we're putting the house on the market." The house. The house I'd helped buy with Thomas's life insurance money. The house where I'd lived during my recovery, where I'd thought I belonged. "We're upgrading," he continued, excitement creeping into his voice. "Found this amazing place with a pool and a 3-car garage. Much better for entertaining. Entertaining. While his mother ate cafeteria food and shared a bathroom with strangers, they were planning parties in their new home with their new pool, purchased with money from my wedding ring and facilitated by my absence. "I thought you might want to know," he added, as if this were considerate rather than cruel. "In case anyone asks where we are." Anyone. Who did he think would ask? I had no friends left. I'd lost touch with most of them over the years, first while caring for Thomas during his illness, then while raising David alone, then while working endless shifts to support our little family. My social circle had shrunk to my son and his wife, who had now definitively removed themselves from my life. "David?" I said, my voice steady despite the storm in my chest. "Do you remember when you were 8 and had pneumonia? I sat beside your bed for 3 days, barely sleeping, monitoring your fever and making sure you could breathe. Do you remember that?" Silence on the other end. I remember thinking I'd do anything to take that sickness from you and put it in my own body instead. That's what love is, wanting to carry someone else's pain so they don't have to. More silence. "I just wanted you to remember that someone once loved you that way, in case it ever matters to you again." I hung up before he could respond, before he could offer empty reassurances or false promises about visiting soon. The phone felt heavy in my hands, like a weapon I'd used against my own heart. That night, I lay in my narrow bed, listening to Rose's labored breathing, and tried to remember when I'd last felt truly happy. The memory came slowly. Thomas's laugh when I'd accidentally put salt in his coffee instead of sugar on our first morning as newlyweds. The way he'd kissed me anyway, and said it was perfect because it came from my hands. Thomas would have fought for me. Thomas would have seen through Camilla's manipulation and David's weakness. Thomas would have reminded our son that love isn't convenient. It's faithful. But Thomas was gone, and I was learning that some forms of abandonment hurt more than death. Death takes your loved ones away from you against their will. Abandonment is your loved ones choosing to walk away while you're still breathing, still loving, still needing them to remember that you exist. I pressed my bare ring finger against my lips and whispered the prayer I'd started saying every night. "Help me remember who I was before they made me invisible. Help me find my way back to the woman who deserves better than this." Outside my window, the parking lot lights illuminated empty spaces where cars should have been, where visitors should have come to remind the forgotten that they were still worth loving. But somewhere in the darkness of that room, something was beginning to stir. Not hope, not yet, but something quieter and more dangerous. The recognition that invisible doesn't mean powerless, and that sometimes the quietest people are the ones who change everything. 6 weeks into my residency at Sunset Manor, I received a manila envelope that would teach me there are depths of betrayal I hadn't yet imagined possible. The return address was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside, legal documents written in the cold language of contracts and clauses informed me that David had petitioned the court to be appointed as my financial guardian, citing concerns about my mental capacity and inability to make sound financial decisions. I read the papers 3 times before their meaning penetrated the fog of disbelief that had become my constant companion. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle and tie his shoes, the teenager I'd stayed up nights helping with homework, the young man I'd co-signed loans for when no one else would trust him with credit, was legally claiming I was mentally incompetent. The evidence presented to support this claim was particularly cruel in its creativity. My confusion about the missing wedding ring was cited as evidence of memory problems. My resistance to accepting professional care was characterized as poor judgment and inability to recognize my own limitations. Even my emotional response to their betrayal was twisted into proof of mental instability. Apparently, crying when your family abandons you is now considered a psychiatric symptom rather than a natural human reaction. But the most devastating revelation came on page 4 of the legal filing. Listed among my assets requiring protection were accounts I didn't know existed, accounts that had been opened in my name using my social security number and employment history. Bank statements showed regular deposits from my old hospital pension, money I'd assumed was being automatically deposited into my personal account for eventual access. David had been intercepting my pension payments for over a year. The math was simple and crushing. Nearly $30,000 that should have been mine, that I'd earned through decades of caring for others, had been systematically stolen by the person I'd trusted most in the world. Money I could have used to secure my own housing, to maintain my independence, to live with dignity in my own choices rather than theirs. I sat in the common room, holding these papers in hands that shook not with age, but with rage, and tried to comprehend the level of planning this betrayal had required. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in a moment of financial stress. This was a calculated, long-term strategy to strip me of every resource that might allow me to resist their control. "Bad news, dear?" Mrs. Henderson, a fellow resident, asked gently. She was one of the few women here whose families still visited regularly, and her kindness had become a small light in my increasingly dark world. "My son," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's been stealing my pension money, and now he wants the court to declare me mentally incompetent so he can legally control what's left of my life." Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled with sympathetic understanding. "Oh, honey, that's more common than you'd think. My sister went through something similar with her daughter. Family members who see elderly relatives as walking bank accounts rather than human beings." The words hit me like a physical blow because they named exactly what I'd become in David's eyes. Not his mother, not the woman who'd sacrificed her 20s and 30s to ensure he had every opportunity, but a resource to be exploited and then discarded when no longer profitable. That evening, I called the one person I thought might still remember the woman I used to be, my neighbor from the old house, Margaret, who'd lived next door for 15 years and had watched David grow up. "Evelyn." Her voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "I've been wondering how you were doing. David said you'd moved to a lovely retirement community, but he wouldn't give me the address. Said you wanted privacy to adjust." Privacy. Another lie, another way to isolate me from anyone who might question this narrative they'd constructed about my voluntary transition to institutional care. "Margaret," I said, gripping the phone like a lifeline, "I need to tell you what really happened." I told her everything. About the stolen ring, about the forced placement in the nursing home, about the intercepted pension payments and the legal proceedings to declare me incompetent. With each revelation, Margaret's gasps of shock and outrage reminded me that my reaction wasn't crazy or unreasonable. It was the appropriate response of someone whose fundamental rights and dignity had been systematically violated. "That's elder abuse, Evelyn," Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. "What they've done to you is criminal. Have you contacted an attorney? Have you filed a police report?" I laughed, and the sound was bitter even to my own ears. "With what money, Margaret? They've taken everything. And who's going to believe a woman in a nursing home whose own son says she's mentally incompetent? The system is designed to protect families, not the elderly people they're abusing." The truth of those words settled around us like a shroud. I was trapped in a perfect legal web, too poor to fight back, too isolated to find allies, and now potentially facing a court declaration that would strip away even my right to speak for myself. After I hung up, I sat in my room and looked at the few possessions they'd allowed me to keep, a photo of Thomas in his uniform from when we were young, and believed love conquered everything, a small jewelry box that now contained nothing but empty velvet compartments, a Bible my mother had given me, though lately I'd been questioning whether any divine justice actually existed in a world where sons could destroy mothers without consequences. On Rose's side of the room, I noticed something I'd never seen before, a small framed drawing clearly made by a child's hand, stick figures under a rainbow with "I love you, Grandma Rose" written in purple crayon. "Rose," I said quietly, "who drew this for you?" For the first time since I'd arrived, Rose turned away from the window and looked directly at me. Her eyes were clearer than I'd expected, filled with a sadness that recognized itself in another person. "My granddaughter Emma," she said, her voice rusty from disuse. "She's 7 now, probably 8 by now. Time moves different here. When did she draw this?" "Before," Rose said simply. "Before my daughter decided I was too much trouble. Before they convinced the court I needed protection from myself. Before they moved me here and told Emma I was too sick for visits." The parallel hit me like lightning. Rose wasn't catatonic or lost in dementia. She was heartbroken. She was another woman whose family had decided love was too expensive, too inconvenient, too much work. "How long have you been here?" I asked. 3 years. 3 years and 4 months and—" she paused, calculating. 16 days. I keep track because I keep thinking someone will remember that I used to matter, that I used to be Emma's favorite person in the world, the one who taught her to bake cookies and braid her hair and believe in magic. What happened to your husband? Dead 5 years now, heart attack at work. Left me the house and his pension, but my daughter was executor of the estate. Sold everything, said I needed professional care, put the money in accounts I can't access. Sound familiar? It sounded like my own story, told with the weary resignation of someone who'd already fought and lost. Rose was my future. Years of staring out windows, marking time until death provided the escape that family love should have been. That night, I made a decision. I took out a notebook I'd purchased from the facility's small gift shop and began to write. Not a journal, not therapy exercises, but testimony, evidence, truth. I wrote about the stolen ring and the exact words Camilla had used when she confessed. I wrote about the intercepted pension payments with dates and amounts I could remember. I wrote about the lies they'd told to get me placed here, about the court documents claiming I was mentally incompetent, while simultaneously acknowledging my ability to remember and articulate complex details about my mistreatment. But most importantly, I wrote about love, about what it means when a parent sacrifices everything for a child, and what it reveals about that child when they respond with calculated cruelty. I wrote about the difference between caring for someone and discarding them, between protecting the vulnerable and exploiting them. As I wrote, something began to shift inside me. The grief was still there. The betrayal still burned like acid in my chest. But underneath it all, I felt something I'd almost forgotten, the strength that had carried me through Thomas's death, through single motherhood, through decades of caring for others without losing myself. I wasn't just a victim. I was a witness. And witnesses have power, even when they're invisible, even when they're forgotten, even when their own children try to erase them from existence. The woman who'd spent her life healing others was about to discover that sometimes the most important patient you can save is yourself. And sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't forgiveness, it's truth. Spoken clearly and without apology by someone who refuses to disappear. Rose had stopped staring out the window and was watching me write. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. I looked up from my notebook, met her eyes, and said words that surprised us both. "I'm remembering who I used to be, and I'm deciding who I'm going to become." For the first time in months, something that might have been hope flickered in Rose's eyes. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to surrender for others to remember they don't have to give up either. But I still had something they'd forgotten about, something they'd overlooked in their careful calculation of how to destroy me. I had Thomas's brother Robert, a man who'd loved me like a sister, who'd helped us through Thomas's illness, and who happened to be one of the most respected lawyers in the state. Tomorrow, I would make a phone call that would change everything. The phone call to Robert came on a Thursday morning when the autumn rain painted gray streaks down my window, and the world outside looked as desolate as I felt inside. I'd been rehearsing what to say for 3 days, knowing I'd have only one chance to convince Thomas's brother that his sister-in-law wasn't the mentally incompetent woman David's legal papers claimed I'd become. Robert answered on the second ring, his voice carrying the same gentle authority I remembered from family gatherings when Thomas was alive. "Evelyn. My God, I've been trying to reach you for weeks. David said you were in some exclusive facility that didn't allow outside contact during adjustment periods." Another lie. Another carefully constructed barrier between me and anyone who might question their narrative. "Robert," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "I need to tell you what really happened. And I need to tell you quickly, before they succeed in having me declared legally incompetent." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then Robert's voice returned, sharp with attention. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." For the next 45 minutes, I laid out the entire story with the methodical precision my nursing training had taught me. I presented facts chronologically, included exact quotes where I could remember them, and provided documentation references for every claim I made. This wasn't an emotional plea from a distraught mother. This was testimony from a woman who'd spent 30 years documenting medical cases and understood the difference between subjective complaints and objective evidence. Robert listened without interruption, occasionally making notes I could hear scratching against paper. When I finished, the silence stretched again before he spoke. "Evelyn, What you've described isn't just family dysfunction or financial disagreement. It's systematic elder abuse, theft, and fraud. The intercepted pension payments alone constitute federal crimes since they involved mail fraud and misappropriation of government benefits. Hearing the legal terms applied to my situation felt like having someone finally name a disease I'd been suffering from without diagnosis. Elder abuse, mail fraud, misappropriation. These weren't just family problems, they were crimes. But Robert, I said, voicing the fear that had kept me silent for weeks, who's going to believe me? I'm in a nursing home. David has medical records showing I was confused and resistant to care. He's probably already told people I'm developing dementia. Evelyn, I've known you for 20 years. I watched you manage Thomas's complex medical care with precision that impressed his oncologists. I've seen you navigate insurance bureaucracies and coordinate treatment plans that saved his life multiple times. The woman I know doesn't develop sudden onset incompetence at 58. The relief of being believed, of having someone remember who I used to be, brought tears I'd been holding back for weeks. More importantly, Robert continued, David's legal filing contains several elements that will work against him. They documented your ability to provide detailed, chronologically consistent accounts of financial transactions. That's not consistent with cognitive impairment. They admitted you were managing your own medications and daily activities independently, also inconsistent with their competency claims. He paused, and I could almost see him shifting into attorney mode, the same focused intensity Thomas had described when Robert was building cases for his clients. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm filing an emergency motion to freeze all accounts pending investigation of the pension theft. Second, I'm requesting an independent psychological evaluation to counter their competency petition. Third, I'm initiating a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office regarding the financial abuse. Robert, I can't afford— You're not paying me, Evelyn. Your family. And beyond that, cases like this matter. They set precedents that protect other elderly people from predators who happen to be related to them. After the call ended, I sat in the common room holding the phone and feeling something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. Not the desperate kind that clings to impossibilities, but the steady variety built on concrete action and legal expertise. But more than hope, I felt something else stirring. A recognition that I hadn't lost everything when David and Camilla stripped away my house and my ring and my savings. I still had my mind, sharp and clear and capable of remembering every detail of what they'd done. I still had my voice, trained by decades of advocating for patients who couldn't speak for themselves. And now I had Robert, whose legal expertise could transform my testimony into consequences they'd never anticipated. That afternoon, I began expanding my written documentation. But this time, I wasn't just recording events for my own processing. I was building evidence with the methodical care I'd once used to document patient symptoms and treatment responses. I wrote down every conversation I could remember, with dates and witnesses where possible. I described the exact condition of the house when I'd arrived for my recovery and when I'd left, documenting items that had disappeared and reappeared. I listed every medical professional who'd interacted with me during my surgery and recovery, people who could testify to my mental clarity and decision-making capacity. Most importantly, I began tracking the financial timeline. When had my pension checks stopped appearing in my personal account? When had David gained access to my medical information? When had they first mentioned concerns about my independence? The pattern that emerged showed months of systematic preparation for this abandonment. This wasn't spontaneous decision-making, but calculated predation. Rose watched me work with growing interest. "You're really going to fight them," she said one evening. Not a question, but an observation filled with something that might have been admiration. "I'm going to expose them," I corrected. "There's a difference between fighting and revealing truth. Fighting suggests both sides have equal validity. This is about documentation and consequences." "My daughter took everything too," Rose said quietly. "Told everyone I was too confused to manage my own affairs. Sold my house, moved me here, visits twice a year with a fake smile and empty promises." I looked at my roommate, really looked at her for the first time. Rose wasn't lost in dementia or depression. She was angry, aware, and systematically ignored by people who found it convenient to believe she'd become incompetent rather than admit they'd chosen to exploit her vulnerability. "Rose," I said carefully, "how's your memory? Can you remember details, dates, conversations?" "Every damn thing," she said with sudden fire. "I remember the day my daughter convinced me to sign power of attorney papers, claiming it was just for emergencies. I remember when she started talking about how much work the house was, how I'd be happier somewhere with activities. I remember her exact words when she said the house had sold. 'Don't worry, Mom. We're putting the money somewhere safe for your care.' Have you tried to fight back?" Rose's expression hardened. "With what? No money, no lawyer. Adult children who've convinced everyone I'm mentally declining. Same trap you were in before your brother-in-law called. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I asked Rose if she wanted me to ask Robert about representing her case as well. "Why would you do that?" Rose asked, suspicion warring with hope in her voice. "Because what happened to us isn't rare. It's a pattern. And patterns can be broken when enough people refuse to accept them as normal. I don't have money to pay a lawyer. Neither did I. But sometimes the most important cases aren't about money. They're about precedent. About making it harder for the next family to do this to the next elderly woman." 3 days later, Robert visited Sunset Manor for the first time, bringing with him a court stenographer and an impressive folder of legal documents. He'd obtained preliminary injunctions freezing David's access to any accounts connected to my Social Security number, and he'd scheduled independent psychological evaluations for both Rose and me. More importantly, he brought news that the district attorney's office had opened an investigation into what they were calling a potential pattern of elder financial abuse, involving multiple cases with similar fact patterns. As Robert interviewed Rose and documented her case alongside mine, I watched something remarkable happen. My roommate, who'd spent 3 years staring out windows and marking time until death, began to straighten her shoulders and speak with the authority of someone whose story mattered. "The house was worth $240,000, Rose told the stenographer with crisp precision. "Mortgage was paid off. My daughter sold it for asking price within 6 weeks of getting power of attorney. Told me it went for much less due to market conditions, but I later found the sale records at the county office. This wasn't a confused elderly woman. This was a witness providing testimony that could stand up in court." That evening, after Robert and his team left, Rose and I sat in our room as equals for the first time. Not just fellow victims, but fellow fighters who'd decided that silence wasn't protection, it was collaboration with their own destruction. "Evelyn," Rose said, "I haven't felt this much like myself in 3 years. Thank you for reminding me that I still exist." "We both exist," I said, looking at the notebook where I'd been documenting our cases. "And now other people are going to be forced to acknowledge that fact." It wasn't about the money anymore, though recovering our stolen resources mattered for practical survival. It wasn't even about punishing David and Camilla and Rose's daughter, though consequences were certainly warranted. It was about refusing to disappear. It was about insisting that love shouldn't be a weapon used against the people who'd shown it most freely. It was about proving that invisible doesn't mean powerless, and that the quietest people sometimes have the loudest truth to tell. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't just surviving each day. I was building toward something. Not revenge, not bitterness, but justice. And justice, I was learning, was the antidote to invisibility. The woman they'd tried to erase was about to become impossible to ignore. 2 weeks after Robert's visit, the atmosphere at Sunset Manor began to change in ways that felt almost electric. The staff started treating Rose and me differently, not with pity, but with the careful respect reserved for people who'd become important in ways that mattered beyond these walls. Mrs. Patterson, the intake coordinator, stopped by our room one afternoon with news that made my heart race. "Mrs. Morrison, you have visitors scheduled for tomorrow. Your son and his wife requested a meeting." Her voice was carefully neutral, but I caught something in her eyes that looked like satisfaction. They seemed concerned about some legal matters. Concerned. David and Camilla were finally learning that actions have consequences, that stealing from elderly women and abandoning them in institutions wasn't a victimless crime they could commit in comfortable privacy. "Will the meeting be private?" I asked. "Actually, your attorney requested that all conversations be documented, given the pending legal proceedings. We'll be recording everything for everyone's protection." That night, I couldn't sleep. For months, I'd existed in their shadow, accepting their version of reality where I was the problem, the burden, the inconvenient mother who needed to be managed rather than loved. Tomorrow, for the first time since this nightmare began, I would face them as an equal. Not as a victim, but as someone with legal representation and documented evidence of their crimes. Rose helped me choose what to wear. "You want to look like the competent woman you are," she said, selecting my navy dress and the small pearl earrings I'd managed to keep. "Not like someone who needs their protection or pity." The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning in the facility's conference room. I arrived early and sat across from 2 empty chairs, my notebook of documentation beside me and Robert's business card in my pocket, like a talisman. When David and Camilla walked in, I almost didn't recognize them. David looked thin and pale, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Camilla still dressed expensively, but her usual confidence seemed forced, brittle around the edges. They sat down without making eye contact, and for several minutes, we simply looked at each other across a table that felt like a courtroom. "Mom," David finally said, his voice uncertain, "we need to talk about these legal issues that have come up. Legal issues. Not theft, not elder abuse, not the systematic destruction of his mother's life and dignity, just vague legal issues that had somehow materialized from nowhere." "What specifically would you like to discuss?" I asked, my voice steady and clear. Camilla jumped in with practiced smoothness. "There seems to be some confusion about financial arrangements. Some misunderstanding about your care costs and how they're being handled." Misunderstanding. As if my stolen pension payments and intercepted mail were simply bookkeeping errors rather than federal crimes. "Let me help clear up the confusion," I said, opening my notebook. "On March 15th, you informed me that you'd sold my wedding ring to fund your vacation to the Maldives. On March 18th, you moved me into this facility. On April 2nd, I discovered that you'd been intercepting my pension payments for over a year, totaling approximately $30,000. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mom, we were protecting that money, keeping it safe for your care, protecting it in accounts I couldn't access, while telling me I couldn't afford anything beyond basic institutional care. You thought I'd never find out. You thought I'd be too ashamed or too broken to fight back." I closed the notebook and looked directly at my son. "What you didn't think about was whether the woman who raised you alone, who worked double shifts to pay for your education, who managed complex medical cases for 30 years, might still be intelligent enough to document your crimes." The word crimes hit them like a slap. Camilla's mask slipped completely. "You ungrateful," she started, then caught herself as she remembered we were being recorded. "Ungrateful," I repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, let's talk about gratitude. Should I be grateful that you stole the last symbol of my marriage to fund your pleasure trip? Should I be grateful that you isolated me from everyone who might have helped me? Should I be grateful that you tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could legally steal what remained of my assets?" David looked genuinely shocked. "We never wanted to hurt you, but you did want my money, and when I became inconvenient to your lifestyle, you wanted me gone. The fact that this caused me pain was irrelevant as long as it served your purposes." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat from her corner of the room. "Mrs. Morrison, your attorney asked me to inform you that the district attorney's office has completed their preliminary investigation. They'll be filing formal charges next week." The color drained from both their faces. This wasn't going to be resolved with apologies or family counseling. They were going to face actual legal consequences for what they'd done. "Charges?" David's voice cracked like a teenager's. "Mail fraud for intercepting federal pension payments. Elder financial abuse under state law. Potentially more charges pending the outcome of the full investigation." I spoke each charge clearly, watching them realize that their careful plan had become a criminal case that would follow them for years. Camilla found her voice. "This is ridiculous. Family financial arrangements aren't criminal matters. Family financial arrangements require consent from all parties. Theft disguised as caregiving is still theft." We sat in silence for several minutes. David stared at his hands while Camilla scrolled through her phone with shaking fingers. Finally, He looked up at me with something that might have been recognition. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. It was the first honest question he'd asked in months. "I want you to remember that I used to matter to you. I want you to understand that love isn't supposed to be conditional on convenience or profit. And I want you to face the consequences of choosing to see your mother as a resource to be exploited rather than a person deserving of respect. Can we fix this somehow?" I looked at my son and saw not the calculating manipulator who'd betrayed me, but the frightened boy he'd been after Thomas died, when the world felt too big and dangerous, and I'd promised him we'd face everything together. "David, the legal consequences aren't mine to control anymore. Those belong to the justice system. But what you can fix is simpler and harder. You can choose to remember who you used to be before you decided that money mattered more than your mother's dignity." As they prepared to leave, David paused at the door. "I'm sorry," he said. And for the first time in months, he sounded like my son. "I know," I replied. "But sorry doesn't undo damage this deep. Sorry is what you say when you accidentally step on someone's foot. What you did to me requires something bigger than apologies." After they left, I sat alone in the conference room feeling strangely empty. The confrontation I'd built up in my mind had been quieter than expected, sadder than satisfying. They'd looked smaller somehow, diminished by the consequences of their own choices. Mrs. Patterson joined me. "How are you feeling?" "Like I finally remembered who I am," I said, and like they finally had to see me as a real person rather than a problem to be solved. That evening, Rose and I sat in our room as the sun set over the parking lot that no longer looked quite so desolate. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we wait for justice to run its course. And we remember that surviving isn't the same as living. We get to decide who we become after this." Tomorrow would bring lawyers and court dates and the slow machinery of legal resolution. But tonight, I was simply a woman who'd refused to disappear, who'd insisted on being seen and heard and believed. The quiet revolution had begun, and there was no going back to invisibility. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after I'd been abandoned at Sunset Manor. Robert's voice carried news that would reshape everything I thought possible about justice and redemption. "Evelyn, the district attorney's office has reached a plea agreement. David and Camilla have agreed to full restitution, community service, and 5 years of supervised probation. More importantly, the court has ordered immediate restoration of your financial independence and revocation of the guardianship petition." I sat down heavily, my legs suddenly unable to support the weight of this news. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means you're free, Evelyn. Free to make your own choices about where you live, how you spend your money, and who has access to your life. The stolen pension funds will be returned with interest. The proceeds from your wedding ring will be recovered and supplemented to account for its sentimental value. Free." The word felt foreign after months of institutional control, of having every decision filtered through staff schedules and facility policies. Free to leave this place, free to rebuild my life on my own terms. But Robert wasn't finished. "There's more. The media attention around your case has attracted some unexpected allies. A nonprofit organization that advocates for elder rights wants to offer you a position as a program coordinator. And Evelyn, Channel 7 wants to interview you about your experience. Your story is going to help other people avoid what you went through." After the call ended, I sat in the common room trying to process this reversal of fortune. Rose found me there an hour later, staring at nothing and everything. "Good news?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me. "The best news," I said, then looked at my friend and roommate. "Rose, how would you feel about sharing an apartment? 2 women who refuse to be invisible, living independently, and probably causing all kinds of trouble." Her face lit up like Christmas morning. "You mean it? You'd want to live with an ornery old woman who talks too much and steals the remote?" "I'd want to live with a survivor who remembers her worth and isn't afraid to demand respect." 3 weeks later, on a bright October morning that felt like rebirth, Robert picked us up from Sunset Manor in his car. The staff lined up to say goodbye, not with the perfunctory politeness usually reserved for departing residents, but with genuine respect for women who'd fought back and won. Mrs. Patterson handed me a folder. "Letters," she explained, "from other residents' families who heard about your case. Some want legal help, Others just wanted to say thank you for proving it was possible to fight back. The apartment Rose and I had chosen was small but bright, with large windows that looked out on a garden instead of a parking lot. As we unpacked our few belongings, everything we owned fitting easily into Robert's car, I realized how little I'd actually lost that couldn't be replaced, and how much I'd gained that was irreplaceable. My new job with elder rights advocacy started the following Monday. My first task was reviewing cases from other families across the state, documenting patterns of financial abuse that prosecutors could use to build stronger legal frameworks for protection. It was familiar work, the same methodical attention to detail I'd used as a nurse, now applied to healing a different kind of injury. But the real transformation came 6 weeks later, when Channel 7 aired their investigative report about elder abuse in our community. The segment opened with my face, clear-eyed and determined, as I spoke directly to the camera. My name is Evelyn Morrison. 6 months ago, my own son stole my wedding ring to pay for a vacation, then had me declared mentally incompetent so he could steal my pension money. Today, I want every family watching this to know that love isn't supposed to hurt like this, and that fighting back is not only possible, it's necessary. The interview lasted 12 minutes. I spoke about the systematic nature of elder abuse, about the legal resources available to victims, about the importance of documentation and the courage required to face family members who've betrayed trust. But mostly, I spoke about dignity, about refusing to become invisible just because others find it convenient to ignore your worth. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Elder Rights Office received over 200 calls in the first week after the broadcast. Women who'd been isolated from family support, men whose children had assumed control of their finances, elderly people who'd begun to believe that institutional care was their only option, all calling to say they'd seen themselves in my story and wanted to know how to fight back. Rose started volunteering at the office too, using her sharp memory and natural skepticism to help identify patterns of financial manipulation in the cases we reviewed. Turns out being suspicious and hard to please are valuable job skills, she told me with satisfaction. The most unexpected moment came 3 months after the broadcast, when I answered a knock at our apartment door to find David standing in the hallway, holding a small jewelry box with hands that shook slightly. He looked older somehow, as if consequences had aged him in ways that comfort and convenience never had. His expensive clothes had been replaced with simpler versions, and his confident posture had given way to something that looked almost humble. "Mom," he said quietly, "I brought you something." Inside the box was a ring, not my original wedding ring, which had been lost forever to their vacation fund, but something new. A simple gold band set with a small diamond that caught the light like a promise. "It's not the same," he said quickly. "Nothing can replace what that ring meant to you. But I wanted you to have something that represented, that showed I remember who you are, who you've always been." I took the box, but didn't put on the ring. Not yet. "David, this is beautiful, and I appreciate the gesture. But jewelry isn't what I need from you. What do you need?" For the first time in our entire relationship, he was asking me what I wanted instead of telling me what I should accept. "I need you to understand that I'm not your burden, or your resource or your problem to solve. I'm your mother, and I deserve to be treated with the same respect you'd show a stranger. Actually, more respect, because of everything we used to mean to each other." He nodded, tears making tracks down his cheeks. I know that now. I don't know how to fix what I broke." "You don't fix it, David. You live with it and you do better going forward. You build something new on the foundation of what you've learned about the cost of treating people like they're disposable." We stood in my doorway for several minutes, mother and son, trying to navigate territory neither of us had mapped before. Finally, he asked the question that mattered most. "Can you forgive me?" I looked at this man who'd once been the center of my universe, who'd become a stranger capable of cruelty I'd never imagined, who was now asking for grace he didn't deserve, but desperately needed. "I can forgive you," I said carefully, "but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. It means choosing not to let your mistakes define the rest of my life. And us? Is there still an us?" "There's the possibility of an us," I said, "if you're willing to earn it back one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one act of genuine care at a time. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the ring he'd brought. It was beautiful, expensive, chosen with obvious care. But it wasn't my wedding ring, and David wasn't Thomas, and this apartment wasn't the life I'd planned. Instead, it was the life I'd built from the wreckage of betrayal, and it was entirely mine. That evening, Rose and I made dinner together in our small kitchen while the news played in the background. A story came on about a new state law strengthening penalties for elder financial abuse, legislation that had been inspired in part by cases like ours. "Look at that," Rose said with satisfaction. "We're making it harder for the next family to do this to the next grandmother." I smiled and put David's ring in my jewelry box. Someday, maybe I'd wear it. When forgiveness had grown into trust, when his actions had caught up to his apologies, when I was certain he saw me as his mother again, rather than a problem to be managed. But tonight, I was simply a woman who'd refused to disappear, who'd turned her pain into power, and her invisibility into advocacy. A woman who'd learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting your old life back. It's building a new one that's stronger than anything that came before. 1 year after I walked out of Sunset Manor, I stood before a room filled with lawmakers, advocates, and families who'd found the courage to speak their own truths. The state capitol building felt like a cathedral of justice, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of people who'd traveled from across the country to witness the signing of the Elder Protection Act, legislation born from stories like mine. When I was 58 years old, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room. My own son sold my wedding ring to pay for a luxury vacation. He told me I wouldn't need it where I was going. He was wrong about many things, but mostly he was wrong about who I was and what I was capable of becoming. The audience listened with the intensity of people recognizing their own experiences in someone else's words. I saw elderly faces nodding with recognition, adult children shifting uncomfortably in their seats, lawmakers taking notes that would become policies protecting the next generation of vulnerable adults. I'm here today not as a victim, but as proof that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, demand justice, and refuse to become invisible just because others find it convenient to ignore your worth. After the ceremony, Rose and I celebrated at the coffee shop where I'd started meeting with other elder abuse survivors. Our small support group had grown into a network of advocates spanning 3 states, all women who'd decided that sharing their stories was more powerful than hiding their shame. Margaret, my old neighbor, had become a regular attendee after discovering that her own elderly mother had been systematically isolated by a daughter-in-law who was draining her savings. She'd learned to recognize the warning signs I'd been too trusting to see. "Evelyn," she said over coffee and celebration cake, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found the strength to fight back?" I considered the question seriously. I'd probably still be staring out windows at parking lots, convinced I deserved whatever scraps of attention my family chose to throw my way. I'd be another invisible woman whose story died with her. "Instead, you're impossible to ignore," Rose added with pride. "The woman who turned her worst betrayal into other people's salvation." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to our apartment. David knocked softly, holding an envelope that looked official and important. He'd been rebuilding our relationship slowly over the past months, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with consistency, respect, and the patient work of proving he remembered how to be my son. Our conversations had grown from careful exchanges to something approaching genuine connection. "Mom, I wanted you to see this before anyone else," he said, handing me the envelope. Inside were legal documents establishing the Evelyn Morrison Foundation for Elder Rights, funded by a significant portion of David and Camilla's assets. Money they'd chosen to donate rather than being court-ordered to pay additional restitution. "We can't undo what we did," David said quietly. "But we can make sure it helps prevent other families from making the same choices. Camilla is actually going back to school to study social work. She wants to understand how we became people capable of such cruelty." I looked at my son and saw something I'd almost given up hope of seeing again: genuine remorse coupled with meaningful action. Not just apologies, but changed behavior that would outlast guilt and continue long after forgiveness was granted. "This is a good start," I said, meaning it. That evening, Rose and I sat on our small balcony watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. The view from our apartment included a garden where children played while their grandparents watched from benches, multiple generations sharing space and time and attention in the way families were meant to function. "Do you miss it?" Rose asked. "The life you had before all this happened?" I thought about the question while watching a grandmother push her granddaughter on a swing, both of them laughing at something I couldn't hear but could feel in the joy radiating from their connection. "I miss Thomas every day," I said honestly. "I miss the innocence of believing that love always protects the people who give it most freely. I miss trusting without needing documentation and evidence. But I don't miss being invisible. I don't miss making myself small to accommodate other people's comfort. I don't miss believing that my worth was measured by my usefulness to others rather than my inherent right to dignity and respect." Rose nodded with understanding. "We became ourselves again, didn't we? Not the women we were before the betrayal, but the women we were always meant to be." The next morning brought news that felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been assembling for months. Mrs. Patterson from Sunset Manor called to tell me that the facility was implementing new policies based on recommendations from our case study. Policies that would make it much harder for families to abandon elderly relatives without oversight and accountability. "More importantly," she said, "we're training staff to recognize the signs of elder abuse and to document suspicious family dynamics. Your courage to speak up is going to protect people you'll never meet." Later that day, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young girl, maybe 7 years old, holding a painting she'd obviously made herself. The painting showed 2 women with gray hair and big smiles, standing in front of a house with flowers growing in the yard. A note in childish handwriting read, "Dear Mrs. Morrison, my grandma Rose told me about you. She says you helped her remember she was brave. I made this picture of you and her being happy. Thank you for taking care of my grandma. Love, Emma." Emma, Rose's granddaughter, the child who'd been told her grandmother was too sick for visits, who'd been kept away by adults who found it easier to lie than to explain their own selfishness. "Rose," I called, "you need to see something." When I showed her the picture and note, Rose sat down hard in her chair and cried. Not the bitter tears of abandonment she'd shed for 3 years, but the healing tears of reconnection and hope. "She remembers me," Rose whispered. "After all this time, she still remembers that I love her." That afternoon, Rose's daughter called for the first time in 6 months. The conversation was awkward and tentative, but it was a beginning. Emma wanted to visit her grandmother, wanted to show her the new paintings she'd been making, wanted to hear the stories Rose used to tell about magic and possibility, and the power of believing in yourself. As evening approached, I found myself holding the ring David had brought me months earlier. Tonight it felt different. Not like an apology or a replacement for what had been stolen, but like a symbol of what could be rebuilt when people chose to do the hard work of earning back trust. I slipped it onto my finger, not because I'd forgotten what David and Camilla had done, but because I'd chosen to remember who I was before they tried to diminish me. I was a woman who'd loved completely, sacrificed willingly, and forgiven carefully. I was someone who'd learned that strength sometimes looks like silence until it's time to speak, and that speaking your truth can change not just your own life, but the lives of people you'll never meet. The phone rang as the sun was setting. It was another woman, another story, another person who'd seen my interview or heard about the foundation and wanted to know if it was really possible to fight back against family members who'd decided love was less important than money. "Yes," I told her, settling into my chair with the patience of someone who understood that justice wasn't a destination, but a journey that required constant, careful walking. "It's possible. It's hard and it's scary, and it requires you to remember who you are when everyone around you is telling you you're not worth defending. But it's possible. How do I start?" she asked. "You start by writing down your story. You start by remembering that invisible doesn't mean powerless. And you start by believing that you deserve better than whatever crumbs of respect they're offering you now." After the call ended, I looked around our small apartment, at Rose reading letters from Emma, at the awards on our wall recognizing our advocacy work, at the photographs showing the life we'd built from the ashes of betrayal. This wasn't the life I'd planned at 58. It was better. It was a life I'd chosen rather than one that had been chosen for me. It was a life built on truth rather than accommodation, on self-respect rather than self-sacrifice. I learned that sometimes the most important gift you can give yourself is the refusal to disappear. Sometimes love means setting boundaries that protect your dignity rather than enabling other people's convenience. And sometimes, the quietest people have the loudest truths to tell. We just need to decide we're worth hearing. Tonight, I was simply a woman who'd refused to become invisible, who'd transformed pain into purpose and betrayal into the foundation for justice. A woman wearing a ring that symbolized not what had been lost, but what could be rebuilt when people chose to remember that every human being, regardless of age, convenience, or usefulness to others, deserves to be seen, heard, and loved. And tomorrow, I would wake up ready to help someone else remember that they, too, were worth fighting for. The woman they tried to erase had become impossible to ignore, and that, I realized, was the sweetest justice of all.